They called me a relic, a leftover from an old regime they wanted gone by Q2. What they didn't know is that my old ways were the only reason our contracts in the Gulf states still breathed. By the time they figured it out, they'd burned a bridge so quietly that the explosion didn't come with fire, just silence, invoices returned unread, and partners who would never answer their calls again. I'm Julia Carter, and for 7 years, I was the bridge between Meridian Bridge Consulting and a world that spoke in languages deeper than Google Translate could ever reach. At 36, I had built something that couldn't be quantified in quarterly reports or efficiency metrics. I had built trust, and in the Middle East, trust is the only currency that matters. The email arrived on a Tuesday morning, sterile and corporate in its precision. Please report to Conference Room 7C at 2 p.m. for a routine personnel review. It wasn't signed by my direct supervisor, Marcus, but by someone from HR I'd never heard of. The sender's name was generic, forgettable, the kind of administrative ghost that haunts every corporation's directory. I should have known then. Marcus had always handled my reviews personally, usually over coffee in his cluttered office where he'd apologize for the company's inability to properly value what I brought to the table. This felt different. This felt like distance, like the careful choreography of Severance. Conference Room 7C was a sterile box on the 14th floor, all glass and chrome and motivational posters about synergy and disruption. I arrived 5 minutes early, as was my habit, and found Brandon Holt already seated at the far end of the table. Our new CEO, brought in 6 months ago to modernize operations and streamline legacy processes, was younger than me by at least 5 years, with the kind of confidence that comes from an MBA and a trust fund. He didn't look up from his tablet when I entered, didn't offer the courtesy of small talk or even basic human acknowledgement, just kept scrolling through what I assumed was my termination package, his fingers dancing across the screen with the casual indifference of someone ordering lunch. "Julia," he said finally, still not meeting my eyes. "Thank you for coming. This won't take long." I sat across from him, placing my hands flat on the table. 7 years of negotiations had taught me to read rooms, to sense the emotional temperature of a conversation before it began. This room was arctic. This conversation was already over. "We're restructuring the Middle East division," Brandon continued, his voice carrying the practiced neutrality of someone who'd had this conversation before. "The board has decided to consolidate our regional operations under a more centralized model. Technology has made many of our traditional liaison roles redundant. Redundant. The word hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. I wanted to laugh. I wanted to ask him if he'd ever tried to explain the concept of contractual honor to a machine translation algorithm, or if he'd ever watched a multi-million-dollar deal collapse because someone used the wrong honorific in an email subject line. Instead, I said nothing. I waited. "Your position is being eliminated effective immediately," he said, finally looking up. His eyes were the color of cheap coffee, and they held about as much warmth. "HR has prepared a generous severance package. You'll find all the details in this folder." He slid a manila envelope across the table. It moved with the weight of finality, of decisions already made and signatures already dried. I didn't touch it. "The Oman contract," I said quietly. "The shipping consortium deal. The infrastructure project in Abu Dhabi. Who's handling those?" Brandon's expression shifted slightly, a micro-expression that might have been irritation or confusion. "Those accounts will be managed by our new automated communication system. We've invested heavily in AI-powered translation and cultural adaptation software. The technology is remarkable, really. It can handle multiple languages simultaneously and adjust for cultural context in real time." I nodded slowly. The way you nod when someone explains that they've decided to navigate the Atlantic Ocean with a paper map and a compass made of wishes. "And the relationship management, the personal connections?" "Modern business is about efficiency, Julia. Personal relationships are, well, they're not scalable. They're not measurable. They're not sustainable in a global marketplace." I stood up then. Not because I was angry, but because I was tired. Tired of explaining why handshakes mattered in a world of digital signatures. Tired of defending the value of knowing that Ahmed preferred his coffee with 3 sugars and no small talk before noon. Or that Fatima's daughter had just gotten engaged and she'd appreciate a brief inquiry about wedding preparations before any discussion of shipping schedules. "I'll need your company devices and access cards," Brandon said, gesturing to a security guard who'd apparently been waiting outside. "Standard protocol." I handed over my laptop, my phone, my keycard. The guard was polite about it, professional. He probably did this twice a week. I was just another face in the endless parade of redundancy. As I walked toward the elevator, I heard Brandon's voice behind me, tinny and hollow through the conference room's speaker system. He was already on another call, already moving on to the next item on his agenda. I caught a fragment of his conversation as the elevator doors closed. "Cost savings will be significant. Quarterly projections look excellent." The elevator descended in silence, carrying me down through 14 floors of corporate ambition and strategic planning. I thought about the 7 years I'd spent building something that couldn't be measured in metrics or captured in performance reviews. I thought about the late-night calls with partners in Dubai, the careful negotiations that happened in the spaces between words, the trust that accumulated like interest over years of consistent, respectful engagement. Most of all, I thought about the folder in Brandon's hand, the one that contained contracts worth nearly $30 million, and the signatures at the bottom that belonged to people who had never spoken to anyone at Meridian Bridge Consulting, except me. I drove home through Newport City's afternoon traffic, past the glass towers and steel monuments to corporate efficiency. My apartment was quiet, too quiet, the kind of silence that amplifies every small sound until the hum of the refrigerator becomes a symphony of displacement. I poured myself a glass of wine and sat at my kitchen table, spreading out the contents of my personal files. 7 years of handwritten notes, cultural observations, and relationship maps that no database could replicate. Business cards with phone numbers that led to private lines. Email addresses that bypassed corporate filters. The accumulated wisdom of 1,000 small interactions that had built something more valuable than any algorithm. There was the note about Hassan al-Majid's preference for morning meetings, written in Arabic script with English annotations. The reminder about Khalid's father's illness and how any delay in project timelines needed to be framed as a concern for family rather than corporate inconvenience. The careful documentation of which phrases translated literally but carried unintended implications, and which concepts required entire paragraphs to convey properly. I picked up my phone and scrolled through my contacts. 347 names, accumulated over 7 years of careful relationship building. Each one represented not just a business connection, but a human being who had extended trust across cultural and linguistic boundaries. They had trusted me, and by extension, they had trusted Meridian Bridge Consulting. Now that trust was about to be fed into Brandon's AI system, processed by algorithms that could translate words but couldn't read the silence between them. I set the phone down and walked to my window. Newport City spread out below me, its lights beginning to twinkle in the gathering dusk. Somewhere in those lights were the offices of competitors, the headquarters of consulting firms that understood the value of human connection in a digital age. And somewhere in those same lights was the future that Brandon's efficiency metrics couldn't predict. I didn't call anyone that night, didn't send any emails, or make any desperate attempts to warn my former partners about the transition they were about to experience. I simply sat in my quiet apartment and waited for the inevitable. Monday morning brought news that traveled faster than Brandon's confidence could contain it. The delegation from Oman had arrived as scheduled. A group of 6 senior executives representing the shipping consortium that generated nearly $8 million in annual revenue for Meridian. They had come to finalize the expansion of their partnership, to sign agreements that would double their commitment over the next 3 years. I learned about it through a text message from Marcus, my former supervisor, who had apparently been kept in the dark about my termination until the delegation specifically asked for me. The message was brief and panicked. "Julia, where are you? The Oman group is here and they're asking for you specifically. Brandon doesn't know what to tell them." I read the message twice, then deleted it without responding. The meeting, as I later learned through my network of sources within the company, lasted exactly 6 minutes. Hassan al-Majid, the delegation leader whom I'd worked with for 3 years, had entered the conference room expecting to see me. Instead, he found Brandon and 2 junior associates, none of whom spoke Arabic, none of whom understood the cultural significance of the elaborate greeting ritual that Hassan had prepared. "Where is Julia?" Hassan had asked in English, his voice carrying the weight of genuine concern. Brandon, according to my source, had stumbled through an explanation about organizational restructuring and technological advancement. He had gestured toward his laptop, promising that their new communication system would provide even better service than what they'd experienced before. Hassan had listened politely, as was his custom. He had nodded at appropriate intervals and asked a few clarifying questions. Then he had stood up, straightened his jacket, and said, "I think there has been a misunderstanding. We came here to work with Julia Carter. If Julia Carter is no longer with your company, then we no longer have business with your company." The handshakes that followed were formal, distant, and final. The delegation left without signing anything, without scheduling follow-up meetings, without the courtesy of false promises about future consideration. They simply walked out, taking with them $8 million in annual revenue and the promise of $16 million more. Brandon, according to my source, had spent the next hour on the phone with the board of directors, explaining how a minor personnel adjustment had resulted in the loss of their largest international contract. By Tuesday morning, word had spread through the industry networks that connected the Gulf states' business community. By Wednesday, 2 more partnerships had been quietly dissolved, their representatives sending polite emails about changed circumstances and new strategic directions. I learned about each development through the careful network of relationships I'd built over 7 years. Former colleagues who still valued my expertise, industry contacts who appreciated the way I'd always treated them as partners rather than transactions, friends who understood that business in the Middle East moved at the speed of trust, not the speed of quarterly reports. The phone calls started on Thursday. Brandon himself, calling from a number I didn't recognize, leaving voicemails that grew increasingly desperate as the day wore on. "Julia, I think there might have been some miscommunication about your departure. I'd like to discuss bringing you back as a consultant. Please call me." I didn't call him back. Marcus tried next, his voice heavy with regret and exhaustion. "Julia, I know you're angry, and you have every right to be, but we need your help. The situation with our Middle East partnerships it's bad, really bad. The board is asking questions I can't answer. And Brandon well, he's learning that some things can't be automated." I didn't call him back either. By Friday, the news had reached the trade publications. Meridian Bridge Consulting loses major Middle East contracts in restructuring fallout was the headline in International Business Weekly. The article was brief and factual, noting only that recent organizational changes had resulted in the dissolution of several key partnerships. It didn't mention my name or the circumstances of my termination. It didn't need to. The industry is smaller than people think, and news travels fast when it carries the weight of consequence. Within a week, every major consulting firm in the region knew that Meridian had lost its Middle East expertise. Within 2 weeks, they knew why. That's when Mark Reddington called me. I'd met Mark 3 years earlier at a conference in Dubai, where he'd been presenting his vision for a new kind of consulting firm. Atlas Nexus was his baby, a startup that specialized in supply chain optimization for companies doing business in the Gulf states. He was smart, well-funded, and most importantly, he understood that technology was a tool, not a replacement for human insight. "I heard about Meridian," he said when I answered his call. "I'm sorry. Their loss is someone else's gain." "Thank you," I said, and meant it. "I've been thinking about our conversation in Dubai," Mark continued. "You mentioned something about the semantics of trust in Arabic business culture. I've been building Atlas Nexus around that concept, and I think we could use someone who understands it from the inside." I waited for him to continue, sensing that this was more than a sympathy call. I want to offer you a position, he said. Head of Middle East and North Africa operations. Full autonomy over client relationships. No interference from corporate, and the resources to build something sustainable. We're not looking for efficiency metrics or cost savings. We're looking for someone who can build bridges that last. The offer was generous, more generous than I'd expected, but more than the money, more than the title. It was the promise of autonomy that caught my attention. The promise of being able to work the way I knew worked, without having to justify every coffee meeting and every cultural gesture to someone who measured success in spreadsheets. I'm interested, I said, but I have conditions. Name them. Complete control over client communications, no automated systems, no corporate templates, no oversight from people who don't understand the markets we're serving, and no meetings about meetings. If we're going to build real relationships, we need to be able to move at relationship speed, not corporate speed. Mark laughed, a sound that carried genuine appreciation. Done. When can you start? I started the following Monday, in a sleek office overlooking Newport City's harbor. Atlas Nexus occupied the top 3 floors of a converted shipping warehouse. Its exposed brick walls and floor-to-ceiling windows creating an atmosphere that felt both professional and human. My office was spacious but not ostentatious, with a view of the water and enough wall space for the maps and cultural reference materials that were the tools of my trade. My first day was spent in meetings with Mark and his core team. Brilliant people who understood that global business was fundamentally about local relationships. They listened when I explained the difference between translation and communication, between efficiency and effectiveness. They asked intelligent questions and took notes that they actually referenced later. It was everything that Meridian had not been. My second day was spent on the phone with Hassan Al-Majid, renewing a friendship that had survived the corporate machinery of my former employer. We talked about his family, his business concerns, and the challenges of finding reliable partners in an increasingly automated world. We talked about everything except business. Until business became the natural next step in our conversation. I heard you've joined Atlas Nexus, Hassan said, his voice carrying the warmth of genuine interest. Mark Reddington spoke very highly of you when he contacted me last month. He contacted you? Of course. He wanted to understand our concerns about supply chain management in the region. He asked excellent questions, and he listened to the answers. It's refreshing to work with someone who understands that business is about people, not just processes. By the end of the week, I had 3 new contracts in various stages of negotiation. By the end of the month, Atlas Nexus had doubled its Middle East revenue. By the end of the quarter, we were the fastest-growing consulting firm in the region, with a client list that read like a who's who of Gulf states business. The success wasn't just about my relationships, though they certainly helped. It was about the approach, the philosophy that Mark had built into Atlas Nexus from the beginning. We treated our clients as partners, not accounts. We invested in understanding their cultures, their concerns, their long-term goals. We communicated in their languages, both literal and metaphorical. Most importantly, we remembered that business is fundamentally about trust, and trust is built one conversation at a time. I heard about Meridian's struggles through the industry grapevine, a steady stream of news that painted a picture of a company in decline. The loss of the Middle East contracts had been just the beginning. Without the revenue stream that those partnerships provided, they'd been forced to make additional cuts. Without the cultural expertise that those relationships required, they'd been unable to replace the lost business. Brandon had lasted 6 months after my termination. The board had finally acknowledged that his vision of automated efficiency didn't align with the realities of international business. His replacement was a veteran consultant who understood the value of human relationships. But by then it was too late. The damage to Meridian's reputation had been done. And in the consulting world, reputation is everything. Marcus had called me once during those months, not to ask for help, but to apologize. I should have fought harder for you, he said. I should have made them understand what they were losing. You couldn't have changed anything, I told him. And I meant it. Brandon was going to do what he was going to do. The board was going to let him. Sometimes the only way to prove the value of something is to let people experience life without it. 6 months after joining Atlas Nexus, I was standing in my office, looking out at the harbor where container ships moved like slow giants through the morning mist. My assistant had just informed me that a representative from Meridian Bridge Consulting was waiting in the lobby, asking for a meeting. I knew who it was before she said the name. Brandon Holt looked different when he entered my office. Older, perhaps, or maybe just worn down by the consequences of his decisions. His confidence had been replaced by something that might have been humility, though it was hard to tell if it was genuine or just another strategic adaptation. "Julia," he said, settling into the chair across from my desk. "Thank you for seeing me." I didn't respond immediately. I let the silence stretch between us, the way I'd learned to do in negotiations. Sometimes silence was the most powerful tool in the room. "I wanted to apologize," he continued, "for how things ended at Meridian, for the way you were treated, for not understanding the value of what you brought to the company." "Thank you," I said. "Apology accepted." He seemed surprised by the simplicity of my response, as if he'd expected more drama or more demands. "I also wanted to ask if you'd consider coming back. As a consultant, we've rebuilt the Middle East division, brought in new people, new systems. But we're still missing something. We're still missing the relationships that you built." I leaned back in my chair, studying his face. "What makes you think those relationships still exist?" "I don't know that they do," he admitted. "But I know that you're the only person who might be able to rebuild them. The only person who understood how to build them in the first place." "You're right," I said. I was the only person who understood that. And now I work for someone who values that understanding. Brandon nodded, accepting the inevitable. "I had to try." "I appreciate that, and I appreciate the apology. But, Brandon, you need to understand something. You didn't just fire me. You fired the idea that human relationships matter in business. You fired the concept that some things can't be automated or optimized or reduced to metrics. You can't hire that back. You can't consultant your way back to trust." He stood up then, extending his hand. "I understand. And I'm sorry. For what it's worth, I've learned a lot from this experience." I shook his hand, feeling the weight of finality in the gesture. "I hope you have. And I hope it helps you do better next time." After he left, I returned to my window, watching the ships navigate the harbor with practiced precision. Each one carried cargo that represented thousands of individual decisions, millions of small acts of trust between people who might never meet but who depended on each other nonetheless. My phone buzzed with a text message from Hassan Al-Majid. "Looking forward to our call this afternoon. My nephew is graduating from university next month, and I'd like to discuss the possibility of him interning with Atlas Nexus. He's been studying international business, and I think he could learn a lot from working with your team." I smiled, typing back a response about how pleased I'd be to speak with his nephew. It was the kind of message that no algorithm could generate, no automated system could anticipate. It was the kind of human connection that turned business relationships into something more valuable than any contract. The irony wasn't lost on me. Brandon had eliminated my position to make his company more efficient, more profitable, more competitive. Instead, he created a competitor who understood his former clients better than he ever had, who spoke their language in ways that went beyond translation software, who knew that business in the 21st century still moved at the speed of trust. As I prepared for my afternoon calls, I thought about the email that had arrived that morning from Meridian's new head of Middle East operations. It was still sitting in my inbox, unopened, marked as spam by filters that had learned to recognize the domain name as irrelevant to my current work. I didn't need to read it to know what it said. I didn't need to respond to know what my answer would be. Some bridges, once burned, can never be rebuilt. Some relationships, once broken, can never be restored. Some opportunities, once missed, never come again. But new bridges could be built. New relationships could be forged. New opportunities could be created. That was the lesson that Brandon had learned too late, and that I was living every day. The harbor stretched out before me, full of ships carrying the promise of connection between distant shores. Somewhere in those waters was the future that I was building, one conversation at a time, one relationship at a time, one act of trust at a time. And somewhere in those same waters was the wreckage of the bridge that Meridian had chosen to burn, sinking slowly beneath the surface of corporate efficiency and strategic optimization, taking with it the understanding that some things in business are too valuable to be reduced to metrics, too important to be left to machines, too human to be automated away. The phone rang, and I picked it up to hear Hassan's familiar voice, warm with the promise of another day's work, another opportunity to build something that would last. "Julia, my friend, how are you today?" "I'm well, Hassan," I said, settling back into my chair. "Very well indeed.